Carol Jenkins was a 20-year-old Black woman who became a victim of a hate crime. She was stalked, brutally attacked, and murdered at the hands of two white men. Despite this heinous crime, her case remained unsolved for more than 30 years. Was it due to the police not finding enough evidence? Did they overlook her murder, or was it more racially motivated? This is the heartbreaking story of Carol Jenkins. Hi, welcome to the Decomposing Flower podcast. I'm your host, Jen, and with me is Kira. In this podcast, we discuss all sorts of interesting cases that we find disturbing or interesting. In this episode, we're going to be discussing the brutal murder of Carol Jenkins. I want to give a brief warning that this is going to be heavy conversations around racism and hate crimes. We are going to be mentioning the KKK. Some of the trigger warnings are going to be racism, hate crimes, stalking, the KKK, and of course, murder. So, of course, if any of that is too close to home or is a trigger, please take care of yourself. You can watch another one of our videos or maybe go have a bath or just take care of yourself. I also want to say that all of my information that I found is online. But if anything I say in this episode is like incorrect or ignorant, please feel free to let us know. And that goes for all of our episodes. But with that, I guess I can begin. So, Carol Jenkins was born on October 19th of 1947 in Indiana. Her father had actually left her family pretty early on. I don't really know how early, but I think when she was like a few months old. But her mom did go on to marry another man named Paul Davis when Carol was around 2. Paul was very good to their family. He truly loved them all. He looked at Carol like she was his daughter. And Elizabeth and Paul would go on to get married and have 5 children. And they ended up living in a home that Paul had built. He was like, it said he was like a couple different jobs, but one of the things they said he was like a farmer. But yeah, like he would build houses as well. So I thought that was kind of interesting. Elizabeth she would just be like kind of stay-at-home mom, and Carol would kind of help because, Carol was a lot older than some of the other kids, and they all looked up to her. They thought she was kind of cool and all that. And so she kind of helped her mom. Carol had actually attended Rushville High School, but she was the only Black girl to attend this school, which usually would be pretty traumatizing for a Black girl to be in an all-white school. But from what we know and from what she has said, she had a pretty good experience there. She had a lot of friends. She didn't really deal with a lot of racism, but I do want to make it very clear, I'm not saying that she didn't experience racism. I'm sure she did in other aspects, and maybe she did in school, but she never talked about it. But from what I found, she had a pretty good experience at this school, especially for this being like the 60s. So yeah, she made friends really easy, and she loved fashion, and she wanted to become a model. And so she was actually planning on, after high school, to go to Chicago. But after she graduated, she just didn't have the money to be able to move. And so she ended up taking like a 9 to 5 job, which she didn't love the job, but like a 9 to 5 job, especially right after high school, is kind of nice considering a lot of jobs you get at that age are pretty, like, not the best hours. I know for me, I was like always working those like shitty like 5 to like midnight sometimes. But yeah, so she didn't like the job, but it paid her bills and it helped her out. So she kind of was doing that for a bit. But in 1967, Paul and Elizabeth had actually told Carol that they were getting a divorce, and I'm not entirely sure why, but apparently it was really hard on the family. Of course it would be. But Carol apparently took it really well. Her and her mom ended up moving into a new place, and Paul and the other kids stayed in the house that Paul had built. From my research, it said that like Paul and Elizabeth didn't really stay in touch, but they weren't like enemies. I'm not really too sure exactly like what their relationship was like after their divorce, but yeah, so Elizabeth, though, would actually go on to get married later on. I think pretty quick, actually. And she ended up adopting another baby with this man, which I'll mention this baby later on in the case because this baby will be relevant. But actually, around this time, Carol got laid off from her job because there was like this union strike going on, and she didn't know how long this union strike was going to be because they can be couple weeks to couple months, and so she knew she needed to get a job. And that's when she found this job as a door to door saleswoman selling encyclopedias. So, this is kind of where our case takes place. So, on September 16th of 1968, it would have been her very first day. And, she was really nervous, like anyone would be on their first day. I don't know about you, but I get really scared on my first day. And so she wanted to really impress her boss. So she got dressed really, really nice. And she was given this task to go to Martinsville, Indiana, which was only an hour away. So the thing about Martinsville is it was known as a sundown town. I'm not sure if you know what that is, but a sundown town is either like a town or like a neighborhood where it's very, very racist. And they basically get their name because they don't want any person of color to be in that town, and they will do whatever they can to get them out, which can be like, just yelling slurs, just doing hate crimes, vandalizing them, or doing violence and murder. And basically, from my research, these towns were kind of like in the north of the states, and even if anyone was like in the town and they were trying to leave, or they got stuck in the town and it's like dark out, if they went to a hotel, like these racist people would come in and just try to do whatever they could to get rid of them. And it was like pretty, like, to be honest, it's kind of scary that that shit happened. And I know like racism obviously still happens now. I don't know if Martinsville is still like really racist, but I would hope that sundown towns don't exist anymore. But just to think that there was a time where, they would just like literally kill people to stay out of their town after dark is so fucked up. Carol was like really scared to go here. Or like from my research, it says she didn't know that it was a sundown town, or she did but she wanted to impress her boss, because actually Paul, her stepdad, had actually in like the 40s, he had played like, I think it was basketball, and his friend had went to Martinsville, and when his friend came back he was like, don't ever go there, it's really, really racist, like it's just not a good place for a black person to be in. And then a year prior, Carol's brother, he played football there, and when he came back, he was like appalled, and he was just like so upset because he said people were extremely racist, like the KKK being there. In my research, it said that they would like burn crosses in certain neighborhoods to get them out, which is like so fucking scary. And, you know, so her brother just said like, he was playing I think he was playing football, and a lot of people were just like yelling at him specifically because he was black, and just using slurs. But he said he was shocked because it wasn't just like the kids doing it, it was also the parents. And I don't really know if like the town they were living in just didn't have that much racism in it, or if it was just that Martinsville was just like extremely racist. But it's just so like terrible that this happened to people. And so the theory is that people suspect is that Carol either never heard of these stories, which I doubt, because I feel like she would have been told that. I mean, like, people aren't stupid. They would have known, especially if you're black, you would know, like, don't go to that town. Like, that wouldn't be something you wouldn't know. But the other theory is that she wanted to impress her boss because it was her very first day, and, she wanted to make a great impression, and she probably, maybe she assumed like, oh, it might not be that bad. And she wasn't going to go alone either. She was going with another black girl and two white men. And so maybe she thought she would be safer, or who knows, maybe she just wanted to go just to make a good impression. And so she got dressed really, really nice. She put on this like really cute turtleneck sweater and like a yellow scarf, and they set on their way to go to Martinsville. It was only like an hour drive. And so once they arrived, they all decided to like split up and go to different neighborhoods. And then they were like, okay, we're just gonna all like meet at this one location around, like, I believe it was like 10 p.m. And so they all get on their ways. And as Carol's beginning to like, go to different neighborhoods and like sell her books, she starts to notice this like dark sedan that was like following her. And, maybe at first she assumed it was someone who's lost, or that it was just someone kind of driving slow. But they started to catcall her. And of course, she was like, I'm not going to respond to this because, I mean, you don't want to respond to catcalling because you never know what they're going to do. But do the wrong thing, and so she just decided to ignore it. And also, she's a black woman. These are two white men. After she kind of ignored them, it started to piss these men off, and that's when they began to yell slurs at her and just saying horrible things to her. So now she knew that they weren't just targeting her because she was a woman, but it was because she was a black woman. And this started to make her really, really scared. Of course, this is scary for, any person to have, like, a person of color to have slurs yelled at you, but especially like in the 60s and in a sundown town. That's terrifying. And, they continued to follow her. And so she was like, I got to get out of this situation. And so she kind of came up with this plan that the next house that she would go to, she would let them know what's happening. And then she would maybe hide out for a bit or get the police or whatever. So she knocked on this like house, and it was this young woman who had answered the door. She was actually around like Carol's age. And Carol was like apologizing, saying, I'm so sorry. I'm being stalked. I'm being followed. Can I stay in for a bit? And this girl, her name was Norma, and she was super upset for Carol. And so she let her inside. And so Norma was married to Dawn. So I'm going to refer to them as the Neils. I think they were new to Martinsville, but they were actually like really upset for Carol. They couldn't believe that people would do this to her. And so they let her inside, and then she kind of explained about like this car and all that. And Don decided to go like look for this car. He's like, maybe I can find the car, get the license plate. And so as he started to walk, he actually noticed the car. And so he got closer, and then he kind of took like note of the license plate. And then he noticed that there was like these two white men, and then they just sped off like really, really fast. And he was like, okay, that's really sketchy. And so he goes back and he tells like Carol like how he has the license plate. And like during this, Norma had actually called the police for Carol. When the police arrived, there was literally only one police officer, and he only stayed long enough to just hear Carol's story, which was around, I think, 10 minutes. And then he's just like, okay, I'll go see if I can find these people. And then he just leaves. He actually found the two fucking men that were harassing her. And he asks them, like, did you guys do this? And they, like, just admit it. They're like, yeah, that was us. Yeah, we were calling her slurs. And he just tells them to knock it off and then just goes on his way. That's it. Yeah, like he just doesn't care, and he's just like, don't do that. He gives them kind of like a little warning, and then he just leaves. But at this point, Carol is still at the Neils, and she's getting really anxious because, I mean, all of this would be really traumatizing and scary. But she's also like, in a town she doesn't know, and all of her colleagues are like miles ahead of her. They were probably way past like I'm sure there was probably like a quota they had to make for their sales. But she also didn't know where they were, and so she was getting really anxious. And so Norma was like, "Hey, why don't I like help you? I can go walk around the blocks with you, and we can go find your colleagues, and then like I'll kind of keep you safe." And so that's what they did. But after they had been walking for like a couple blocks, they still hadn't noticed or found any of her like colleagues. And so they headed back to the Neil's place. And then it was actually getting dark now. And Norma and Dawn, they were kind of like, hey, why don't you just spend the night with us? Then you can go home in the morning. But Carol said that she felt like she was being a burden, and that she just wanted to get home, and that, it was getting time, like it was the meeting time almost, and that she was just gonna go. And at this point, I believe it was around 8 p.m. So it's like dark now. And she goes to leave. And so she actually meets up at the meeting point, and she's waiting for like 20 minutes. But she doesn't see anyone. She's just kind of waiting. But then she notices this car that's speeding right at her. And this car just swerves in front of her. Two men just come running right at her. And so Carol's like freaking out. She's scared. And so she starts to run as fast as she can. And this is all happening within seconds. But as she was trying to run, she wasn't fast enough. These two men had actually caught up to her. And one of the men had actually grabbed her wrist and like held them behind her back. And another man grabbed a screwdriver and
What?
stabbed, yeah, grabbed a screwdriver and stabbed Carol right into her chest, super hard and deep. And then they just ran back into the car and sped off away. And, Carol's just in like the middle of the street. She's like falling, she's staggering, she's so weak. She can't even get up. She keeps like getting up and then falling down. And there was like this teen that was there and they had noticed this and they realized, oh my God, I gotta get her help. And so they run to the nearby restaurant and is like, you guys gotta call the police. And that's what they did. Now, it's speculated that the reason they didn't call the ambulance is because she was bleeding more internally and not externally, but she also had on this scarf that probably and her jacket and was like probably covering it. And so they probably just didn't notice her bleeding, I guess. Still think that they should have called the ambulance anyways, but yeah, so the police end up arriving and then they notice like, oh my God, she's like bleeding really terribly. We got to get the ambulance. And so the ambulance arrives, which would have been around 30 minutes after she had been stabbed, and she was getting really, really weak. And so once they get her into like the ambulance, she's like passing out and then coming back. But unfortunately, she died upon arrival at the hospital. She would have been 20 years old. At this point, after she had died, the police are like, they kind of move her scarf, and that's when they had realized how bad this wound truly was. It was a single stab wound, but it was so deep and small. And actually, like fasting like forward a bit, but in the autopsy, it actually had they found out it stabbed and punctured her heart, which is like really deep. So after the police realize like this is a murder, they're like, oh shit, we didn't like secure the crime scene. And so they're like, we gotta go back. And so once they get back to the crime scene, it's completely fucking ruined. There's so many people walking all over the crime scene. People are touching a bunch of things, evidence, and now it's being tampered with. And so none of this could be used in court, of course. And so they're like, oh shit. And so now they're like, what are we gonna do? They found two objects, which was one of them was her glasses. She wore these like really cute cat eye glasses from like, like the very stereotypical 60s. And then they also found a notebook, which was like, it was a few blocks away. I honest to God do not know why that this was relevant. I mean, it was a few blocks away. I don't know how they like linked it, but they thought it was important. And so the police are like, okay, we have two things, but now we need some suspects. And one of the things that's really weird about this case is that there was no witnesses that saw any of this. Not a single one, even though it was like in the middle of the street, downtown, there had to have been someone that would have saw this because I feel like you would have heard the car speeding. Like, I don't know about you, but whenever I hear a car speeding really fast, I kind of always go and like be like, what the hell is happening? So I feel like there was probably witnesses, but they did. Oh, sorry.
Well, like, I mean, like, I also can see what you're saying too. Like, I mean, they're in this town where they're so racist and they kick out racist people. Like, what's the odds that they're gonna, like, a person? I mean, what was it? The Millers? The Mills? They were so nice to her, but I mean, there's also people accosting her just with skin color. So, I mean,
Oh,
I don't
yeah.
think all people are bad, but who knows?
Oh, yeah. And it gets worse because they find two suspects. And the first suspect was a construction worker. He didn't have an alibi and he was considered really sketchy. So I guess they kind of used him as a suspect. And then there was another suspect, and he was a man who owned a car garage, which is where that notebook was found. And so they end up taking these two men into custody and doing their little interviews with them and questioning them. And they get them to do a polygraph test. And this is the 60s, and they believe these graphs. Like, they were always like, they treated these like it was God telling them everything. They treated it like it was facts. And so both of these men had passed the test. And so they were like, well, there we go. They're ruled out. And actually, after a few weeks later, that construction worker he actually left Indiana and like flew to Florida. And so the police were like, "Oh, that's kind of suspicious." And so they actually tried to find him and track him down, but they find out that this man actually died in a shootout. So they're like, "Well, can't do anything about that." But they only had like a few leads, but within 6 weeks, they just shut the case. They close it and it goes cold. They just seemed like the police didn't care. The family, like Carol's family, was devastated. But Paul Davis, he was pissed. He truly believed that this was like motivated, this was racially motivated, that the police just didn't care that if Carol was like a young white woman or just a white woman, period, that they would have cared. And I 100% agree. And so, like, he kind of asked, like, the police, like, why don't you get the FBI involved if you guys can't do your job? And they literally say to him that they didn't want to get the FBI involved. And then they also said that the FBI had way more important things to deal with.
Bruh.
Like, yeah, what a cruel thing to say to a grieving father and just to anyone, but especially like a father. Like, yeah, he wasn't her biological dad, but he was still her fucking dad. Like, that's just to me is so cruel. But I think one of the worst things out of this entire case, and it makes me actually almost a little bit emotional, is that when the newspaper started reporting on this, they didn't report Carol, like refer to Carol as Carol. They referred to her as the N-word girl. That just makes me so fucking angry and so sad that this girl was murdered and they're just going to refer to her as a slur. Like, what the fuck is wrong with you? Like, so it just gets me so heated. And actually, after like these newspapers start coming out, people find out information that the Neils had actually taken Carol into their home when she was being stalked, and they were pissed. They were pissed at them for helping a black woman. And so they received a shit ton of hate mail. They were getting harassed on the street. They were getting called like specific slur names, and they even had their home vandalized. They said they would be out like grocery shopping and they would just get called horrible things. But this didn't stop them. They continued to care for Carol actually up until 2014, which I'll get into near the end. But yeah, they continued to seek justice for Carol with her family, and they didn't let any of this hate like stop them. Like, they were like, you know what, we don't fucking care. Like, we're good people, you're pieces of shit, you're just a bunch of racists. Like, why are we gonna listen to you? Like, no. This case would go cold and would stay cold for over 30 years until 1998. So that baby that I had mentioned earlier, that was her mom's like adopted baby, he was actually meeting up with some of the siblings, and he had informed one of the sisters that he met someone who claimed that they knew what happened to Carol. This person had claimed that they knew who killed Carol and how they got away, and that they even knew that the man who killed Carol was kept in hiding with all the other like racists and like all the locals until the police had closed the case, and that this person said they knew where the murder weapon was, and that this like murderer had thrown the screwdriver down an underground gasoline tank where that car garage was, where that notebook was found. And so the siblings are like, holy shit, we need to do something about it. And so they decide to contact someone, and they decide to contact the police. And the police decided to take this actually really serious because, this is the 90s now, and they wanted to show them, like, hey, we're not racist anymore. We actually care. We're not like those cops. And so they were taking it really, really serious. They reopened the case, and they, like, within a few months, they got everything organized and they flew down to where this gasoline tank was. And when they opened it, it was unfortunately empty. There was
Oh.
only a chisel there, which was like, it was just too thick to be the murder weapon, and it was nothing. And so the case actually got closed again. And at this time, it was really like, traumatizing for the family because it had been over 30 years, and they thought like Carol's never going to get justice. They're never going to know what happened to their daughter, their sister. So they were heartbroken. But in 2000, Elizabeth is at home doing her thing when she receives this phone call. And when she picks it up, it's this woman. She doesn't know who this woman is, but she seems really, really anxious. And she says to Elizabeth, that she feared that her father had killed Carol. And so Elizabeth is like, "What are you talking about?" And she's shocked. And so she starts to ask this girl some questions. But as she's asking her questions, this girl starts to get really anxious. And then she just says to her, "I have a family. I fear for my life." And then she just hung up. And so after that, Elizabeth is like really shocked. She's like, What the fuck?" Like, that would be very like shocking to hear someone say that. And so she really did believe this woman though. And so she didn't really know what to do, but she decided to call up Paul because she's like, Paul needs to know this. Even though they're not in contact anymore, she's like, he needs to know this. And so she calls Paul, and Paul's like, "Wait, what?" And he's like, "Hold on, I need to see you. We need to have a conversation in person." So Paul goes down to where Elizabeth is, and they talk for a few hours. And as they're talking, they're like, "This is a huge step," but they were like, "We got to get someone involved," but they didn't want to get the police involved for a lot of reasons. The main reason was if it was a hoax, they didn't want the police to look at them and think that they're wasting their time or that they're, crazy. Because there's a lot of people who just do this where there's like a cold case and people will just like, they're just cruel and they'll just like call up the victims' families and like pretend they know just to, or they call up the police, or sometimes people just think they have the information and they don't. But they were also really worried that they were going to waste like the police time, and so they didn't want to become like the boy who cried wolf. And so they're like, how are we gonna like solve this? Like, who are we gonna contact? They proceed to contact a private investigator. His name was William McAllister. He was considered to be one of like the best private investigators. He was so good that he found a lead within 5 minutes.
Bruh.
So like just thinking of all those.
Was he really good, or were the police just really, really fucking bad?
Yeah, exactly. So like just honest to God, like the police are like, 6 weeks, they can't find shit, they close it, they can't do anything. But this man finds it in 5 fucking minutes. So one of the leads he had found was, you remember that construction worker I talked about who died? Well, he never fucking died. That never happened. He was alive. And so this private investigator goes on and he goes on to find a lot more leads. But as this happens, the police realize that, they had hired this private investigator and they were like, wait, we want to be a part of this too. And so they reach out to like Paul and they're like, "Hey, like how about we team up? We can like join forces together and do it together. We're not like those cops before. We're not racist. We want to help you." And like Paul was skeptic. He was like, "I don't trust you guys. You guys didn't do your job the first time. We don't trust you at all." And like some people believe that the police generally were like good, like they wanted to help. And like of course this was like new police, but a lot of people feel like the police just wanted to clear their name and not be considered racist anymore, or like how they didn't care for this black woman because, oh, it's the 2000s, it's the new millennium, they're not racist. And I'm sure these cops maybe weren't racist, but still it just comes across kind of sketchy that now they want to help them. But the police, like, they did understand that Paul and Elizabeth and all of them had a really negative experience. And so they're like, why don't you guys come down to the station and we can just discuss everything? And so that's what they do. They go down to the station and they claim that they're going to solve the case. They're like, "You know what? We're going to solve it." And Elizabeth, she believes them. Like, she's like, "I believe them. They're going to do it." And so she signed off all the new evidence that she had gotten. And they actually found leads within a few months. So the good thing is they did get information, and there was, I think it was within a few months, they received like a letter that, and the letter had said they knew who the killer was and that the killer's name was Kenneth Richmond, and that he had killed someone, a black woman, in front of his 7-year-old daughter Shirley, and that this letter believed that this was Carol's killer. And so again, the police are kind of skeptic, but at the same time, they had never heard of the name Kenneth Richmond before. They decide, they're like, okay, let's put his name into like the database. And They find out this man is now 70 and he's living in a care home. But they also find out that he is a criminal who does a lot of hate crimes and had been affiliated with the KKK since he was a teenager, and he was still an active member even while being in the care home. They also found out he only lived 45 minutes away from Martinsville and he had
Oh,
all these friends. Yeah, and so a lot of the people that still live there were still pretty racist, and so they decide to arrest him for questioning. They're like, we gotta do this. And at the same time, they contact Shirley, and so they call up Shirley and they ask her about Kenneth. And she mentions that's her dad, but she actually cut contact with him in the 70s because she was afraid of him. He was scary, and the fact that he was just disgusting and racist and part of the KKK, and she didn't want anything to do with that, and she changed her name. But she said she was terrified of her father, and she said she remembered how her father and his friends were all openly racist. And so the police ask her, like, hey, did you call Elizabeth and did you leave this letter? And Shirley's confused. She's like, no, I never did that. And so she kind of claimed, like, she's like, honestly, I just been wanting to forget about this entire situation and like my father and everything, but I never did that. And so as the police kind of dig up, they find out that the call was actually made by a woman named Connie, who was actually Shirley's sister in law, and they were really, really close. Shirley had obviously been traumatized from seeing a murder and dealing with like a father in the KKK. And she had actually told Connie everything about this and how, like, she has told her the story that when she was 7, she had witnessed her father killing an innocent black woman and that it really upset her. And as like the years go on, Connie and Shirley talk about it, and Connie finds herself trying to console Shirley, but she knew something needed to be done. She was seeing how this was really fucking with Shirley, but she also was like, we need justice for this black woman. We need to talk about it. And so I guess she decided to make the first leap, which was calling Elizabeth. I don't really know exactly why she assumed it was Carol, but I think she probably, like, the times made up, like added up. But she actually, when she made the call, she kind of regretted it because she was actually so scared of Kenneth. She thought, like, what if he comes after Shirley and me and our family? And so she, like, Connie was pretty scared. And so at this point, the police do ask Shirley, why don't you come down and just share your story? And so Shirley tells her story. She said she was in Martinsville with her dad and another man. They were both part of the KKK. And Shirley, she was just 7 years old, and they were just out driving. Her dad and this man were both drunk, and so they were drinking and driving, and they had spotted this black woman, and they started to kind of mock her and just say terrible things. And then they kind of were like, oh, she's lost. And not lost in the way like, oh, she's just in a town she doesn't know. No, they meant she's lost as in she's a black woman walking after dark in a sundown town, and they said that they needed to do something about her. So they decided to stalk this black woman, and they start yelling slurs at her, and then they drove away from her, and then they come back speeding after her, and they get out of their car and they go after her. Shirley said she saw this black woman just run for her life, and then she just watched her father and this man stab this innocent black woman in the chest. And Shirley said that she watched her father and this man come back into the car and this black woman just struggling to get up. And she watched her collapse one final time. And she said she remembered her father and this man like laughing and being like she got what she deserved. And then they got home and her father tried to bribe her to stay quiet with $7 fucking.
What?
Yeah.
Dude, what?
Yeah.
I. Someone's fucking life is worth $7?
Yeah, and like $7 would be equivalent of like $60 now, but still, like, what? And so as the police are listening to it, like, the story's adding up, but she actually says something that kind of just proves that her father was the murderer. And it was, she said, if the girl was wearing a yellow scarf, my father is probably the killer. And the reason why this was just absolute proof was because they had never actually mentioned at all in this case or to the public what Carol was wearing, and that Carol was wearing that yellow scarf. And so for Shirley to know that, she had to have been there. And obviously, she was 7 years old. She couldn't have been the killer. So that kind of confirmed that Kenneth was the killer. But the unfortunate part was they were never actually able to identify the other man. So that man could actually be out walking right now. And so when they like tried to talk to Kenneth about it, he actually wouldn't budge. He wouldn't tell them who that man was. But the part that makes me so angry is Kenneth wasn't fit to stand trial because he fucking had terminal cancer.
Bro.
And he actually died on August 8th, 2002, which was 2 weeks prior to the trial. And so the unfortunate part is no one actually went to jail or prison for Carol's murder. So she never really got justice, but it's said that Kenneth had actually admitted to the murder in jail, but it was never like recorded. But some people speculate that the police had kind of made that up just to give like Carol's family some kind of closure. But yeah, so no one ever went to jail for Carol's murder. And a little aftermath is in 2014, and this makes me so mad, is the Neal family, they had been close to this case for so long. They never stopped thinking about it. I saw in an article that the family said that they really wanted to show like we never stopped thinking about Carol. And they actually proposed to in like 2014 to make a memorial for Carol in Martinsville. But the county commissioner ended up scrapping it after a bunch of like racist locals in 2014 again were complaining that they didn't want a fucking memorial for a black woman. And so they just never did the memorial. Like, although I did see some people saying that's probably a good idea that they wouldn't do a memorial for a black woman where she was murdered in a town full of racists that still have racists, because I'm sure it probably would have been like vandalized or whatever. But yeah, that is the case of Carol Jenkins and the horrible racist crimes that were done to her. We will see you in the next episode.